Hello and welcome to Fidelity Connects. I'm Pamela Ritchie. President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China have world leaders and markets reacting sharply. Speaking from Parliament Hill yesterday, Prime Minister Trudeau says Canada will immediately begin implementing 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods. We've seen that go into effect. Trudeau bluntly called Trump's blanket tariffs, quote, dumb, and said Canadians also, quote, will not back down from a fight. So how will these tariffs impact Canadian industries and sectors? And how should Canadian officials approach negotiations and trade talks moving forward? To help us explore Canada's next steps, I'm very happy to be joined here today by former Canadian ambassador to the United States during the Obama and Trump administrations, David MacNaughton. David, thank you for joining us here today.
Pleasure.
Delighted to have you here. We'll invite everyone to send their questions in as well. You are currently in Europe, not far away from some of the action, actually where Canada has been kind of lobbying to get some new trading partners in a way, or bolster old ones. Could you tell us a little bit about what diplomacy, which you are steeped in, means right now?
Well, I think that the world has obviously changed a lot in the last decade or so, and that most of the multilateral organizations and the alliances that have been formed since the Second World War are in tatters, and we've got big powers trying to consolidate their influence over either geography or whatever, and now we were kind of relying on the United States as our NORAD partner and our NATO partner, and now it becomes clear that we have difficulty relying on them because the President of the United States signed a trade deal with us in 2018 and said that it was the best trade deal that had ever been done, and now 7 years later he imposes 25% tariffs across the board with no real rationale for it. I mean, he talks about reciprocal tariffs, and yet we have reciprocity. We don't put tariffs on American goods under the USMCA, CUSMA, whatever one wants to call it. Then he talked about fentanyl, and that's not a serious. It's a serious issue, but less than 1% of the fentanyl that goes into the United States comes from Canada. And that's their figures, not ours. And so, all of the things that we used to rely on, including, getting members of Congress to speak up because it was in their interest to do so, members of the U.S. business community to speak up, they all seem to have gone silent, and Trump is sort of running the show with Peter Navarro yapping in his ear all the time. And so we're in a totally different world. And
can I ask you if you think that will shift at some point, Ambassador MacNaughton? Do you think at some point, right now, perhaps Congress members who would normally be able to have some power up at the top, will that shift, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what's happened right now, like in his first administration, Trump brought in a lot of really good, solid people who gave him good advice, and he actually listened to some of it. And he had a Congress that was split, and he had to get them on side. And even, a lot of the Republicans were prepared to stand up to him to defend their own states' interests, constituents' interest. Right now, what you see is he's surrounded himself by and large with a lot of people who tell him what he wants to hear, and he's got senators and members of Congress who are afraid of being primaried. As we get closer to the midterms, I think you're going to see that shift.
That's really interesting. Feel free to take some water if you want there. It's interesting, yeah. And the Prime Minister's Council, which you are on, there's the list of if you know politics and power, they're basically household names, including yourself. I'm curious what this council has been doing, because exactly that, it is meant to inform the Prime Minister and for advice to be created there. I'm curious what you thought of the Prime Minister's press conference yesterday. It was strong words, actually. he was advised to say some of those words?
Yeah, I think it was both advised to, and I think he, senses the mood of Canadians. I mean, when you have, Canadians at hockey games and basketball games and other sporting events booing the U.S. national anthem, you understand that the world's a little bit different.
Right.
And, I think Premier Ford in Ontario has, been able to capture that mood and that sentiment. So I think the Prime Minister, had to get up there and be defiant and say we're going to retaliate. And, it's been really frustrating for everybody, premiers and the business community and the federal government, because Trump has not come up with a real rationale for doing what he's doing. It shifts every day. Today, he put out something on Truth Social about, well, it's because they don't treat our banks fairly. I mean, so I think Canadians are angry. They're frustrated, and I think that the politicians are reflecting the mood of the country at the present moment.
Okay, interesting. When you heard last week, along with the rest of us, so there was the Oval Office with President Zelensky and Trump. I think we've all seen that at this point. Shortly after there, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said within another interview, one of the things is it would be nice if Canada, like Mexico, basically stopped buying component parts for EVs. And if maybe Canada would commit to stop buying, I don't know exactly what from China, but sort of that idea of a more protectionist Fortress North America. Did that sound like where they're going? But did that sound like you could read those tea leaves a little bit?
Well, the Americans have been talking about the challenge of China exporting semi-finished goods to Mexico and then having them finished off in Mexico and sent into the United States duty-free. It's essentially been something that, Bob Lighthizer has talked to me about and others have talked to me about it. But it's always been focused on Mexico. The Canada doesn't have the same kind of problem. And we also, when the U.S. put tariffs on EVs out of China, we matched them. So what Bessent is talking about is something that actually we've been pretty good on, and yet it's not acknowledged. And so, I think hopefully let Nick and others get more sort of into their jobs, they will understand some of the facts rather than, excuse me, simply repeating Navarro tales.
Right. Okay. So, and do you think that in time, a grand strategy or a grand deal with China, again, is also one of the many things on the list of the administration? I'm sort of trying to get a sense of how Canadian trade would work with that if we could continue diversifying our own trading partners, bolstering relationships that are already there with China, with others, or if that doesn't look like that will work well with an eventual U.S.-China trade deal.
Well, I don't know whether there'll be a U.S.-China trade deal or not. I mean, we will see. I'm skeptical about that.
Are you? Okay.
I think, we do have to diversify our exports, but I think one of the things that we need to do right away is to actually leverage some of our strengths that we've been, neglecting. I mean, we do have, the ability to export LNG. We do have critical minerals. We've had trouble getting them to market because of complicated approval processes. And we should just not, stand in our way to our success.
Do you find that part of those, the interprovincial trade barriers, for instance, I mean, there's been announcements that many of those have been melted away. I mean, some of them have to come into practice, but what else do we need to do? So that's one. What else do we need to do bolstering? It sounds like there's going to be some building, some infrastructure, some real building.
Yeah. yeah, we need to build some additional pipelines to get our products to market, to our oil and gas to market. We need to figure out how we're going to get critical minerals out of the Ring of Fire and other places. I mean, when I was in Washington, I spoke to the National Security Advisor to the president at the time, and it suggested, excuse me, we could be a source of critical minerals.
Yes.
Like we were of aluminum when they helped start our industry. And his response to me was, "Well, that'd be great, but we need them before you will get around to getting them out of the ground in 2050."
Right.
And we've forgotten that this country was built on getting big projects done in reasonable time.
By all means, don't worry. Yeah, I'm sorry, you're not feeling well. Well, so these sort of national building projects that ultimately, the Ring of Fire being in Northern Ontario, where it's not very accessible for mining to get things to and fro at all, it would require quite a lot of investment. These are the types of things that you think they are genuinely on the books in Ottawa and provinces as well. But I mean, are we getting the message about the red tape?
Yeah, I think so, but I mean, not quick enough. In Vancouver at an LNG conference a year and a half ago, and there were 40 countries there, and there were 15 Indigenous chiefs, all who were supporting LNG exports, and the senior representative of the Government of Canada was an assistant deputy minister. I mean, we have an opportunity to partner with Indigenous communities on natural resource extraction. They are willing to come to the table in a meaningful way, and I think this gives us huge opportunity, which we're just not moving quickly enough on. We have to get out of the way of get out of our own way and stop focusing on process in government and focusing on outcomes.
Right. And do you assume that some of those discussions about perhaps specifically how we do that are within the negotiations with Washington right now, talking about how we may move faster on X, Y, and Z to make some of those things? I think
so. Yeah, I mean, and the other thing we've got to do is actually step up, on defense and security. We have fallen behind. We haven't been doing our, excuse me, our fair share. We need to actually start doing what our history has been. Again, I talked about, building a country that is a very, it's huge landmass, and we got projects done, but we also, we're great in terms of defending our country and our allies in the First World War, the Second World War. We have done our part throughout history to defend ourselves and our allies, and we just, have fallen behind.
Yeah. So there's a lot of lots of room there ultimately. When you look again at sort of the diplomatic discussions back and forth, I think you had mentioned before that, in any negotiation, they're going to take advantage of the other person's weakness. What do you think Trump is seeing as Canada's weakness right now, that he's creating wedge issues, creating, they're probably a fairly long list actually, but how would you take that list?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he's, first of all, he's a bully at heart, but also he sees, a prime minister who was very low in the polls, who stepped down. There isn't, we haven't got a successor yet. There's uncertainty about an election, and he's just come off of what he describes as, one of the greatest victories ever, and he's feeling pretty, pretty confident and pretty arrogant about where he's at. And until we've got, a new government and a government that's elected and a clear, position with the premiers supporting it and the business community supporting it and labor supporting it, I think you'll still see weakness. And I think that was one of our strengths in the trade negotiation, was that we had, a real Team Canada approach to it, and we had a real focus on what outcomes we wanted, and everybody worked together.
Yeah, this is in Trump 1.0 when you were doing some of those negotiations. Do you think some of the comments that have come from Premier Ford about, to the extent of turning off the power, actually, as sort of a later stage negotiating discussion, but do you think that Americans' attention, those at the Congress and Senate level, but actually individual Americans, business owners, do you think we've got their attention with comments like that?
I think we're getting it, but it's funny how they really aren't aware of the interdependence with Canada, and how much, obviously we are way more dependent on them trade than they are with us. But having said that, there are an awful lot of states that rely on exports to Canada. There are goods that go back and forth across the border. And by and large, the Americans are unaware of that. And so I think one of the things that this is doing is actually getting their attention, which is good.
Which is really good. Yeah, no, it's ultimately showing. There are many things that go back and forth across the border. On the agricultural front, please go ahead and get some water. We could talk a little bit about what we're seeing from different, we may have just lost your lighting there a little bit. Let's see. Oh, there's the lighting. Perfect. What we're seeing on the agricultural front, and again, this has to do with many of the states that would border Canada across sort of the prairies area, and even animals going across the border. This is something else that needs to be focused in on. Again, do we have the attention? We'll add lumber in there as well.
Yeah, well, I wasn't aware of all of the agricultural things that go back and forth, including animals, until I was down in Washington, and I think we did a pretty good job of getting agricultural groups on side. They don't understand what an important role potash plays in fertilizer and all that kind of stuff. So I think we're fighting, in many cases, ignorance about the importance of Canada. And I think, with this retaliation, if we do it properly and focus some of their minds, then you're going to start to see pushback on Trump. And I think he'll, the one thing about him is that this isn't about ideology. It's about, he's transactional. And so he will find a way to get out of whatever it is that is hurting him, either, his reputation, his, personal ego, or his politics. And, we probably have to find some kind of a path that he can declare victory on, even if it isn't that important. But, we're going to face some uncertainty and some pain. And I think we need to hang tough and not grab at the first token that he presents in front of us, because they will try that. They'll try to say, oh, well, maybe we'll go down to 12.5%. And we just have to say, no, I'm sorry. You said you wanted reciprocal tariffs. That's what we're going to have. And if you don't do it, we're going to make you pay. But, it's going to take a little bit of time.
There are many projects are long lead. And so there's sort of the discussion of the short term, the duration, certainly, of the tariffs. Is it short term? Is it longer term? And where that falls. Industries like the EV battery industry in Ontario, for instance, which has been really taken to the cleaners lately. It's been almost collapsed in a lot of ways. The discussion of what's going on in Mexico with EV, as you say, sort of partially put together batteries that are coming from China, that is not so much allowed. It's been discussed before that Ontario could carve out a place for itself as, maybe not today, discussion of EVs, But maybe as a longer term project, that's something that Ontario could specialize in. Is that something that you see being, again, built into the negotiations, or do we just not talk about EVs at this point?
Oh, I mean, I think the only talk that we need to have about EVs right now is tariffs on Teslas, but
Okay, I like that. While you're making me laugh, I was wondering if you have any, just some stories between leaders, some that you could either name or not name so much in recent years that kind of bring to light what we're dealing with here. Because there's a lot of education that's going on for Canadians of exactly what we sell and don't sell to the United States and what we can buy from each other, but also very much from Americans. When you were sitting around tables in DC trying to educate probably people about what Canada is all about, any interesting anecdotes there?
yeah, I mean, I remember, Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin was on to me about our dairy policy and how difficult it was, and I was somewhat sympathetic to him, but I then also said, because he was making all sorts of threats, I said, the largest employer, private sector employer in Wisconsin, is a company called Epic, and they do hospital information systems. And Canada is the largest export location for Epic. And I said I could close that market down with 3 phone calls to premiers, and it would happen overnight. And, he kind of said, oh, I really wasn't aware. I wasn't aware of the importance of Canada. And secondly, I hadn't really thought about the fact that you've got a government-controlled system that could shut it down pretty quickly.
Interesting.
You don't want to make too many threats like that, but on the other hand, illustrating the facts are important. And the other one was, one of my favorite anecdotal stories was with Kelly Craft, who was the ambassador to the United States to Canada. And she phoned me in May of 2019 and said that I wanted to know whether the Prime Minister was going to be in town in Ottawa at the end of May. And I said, why? And she said, because there's going to be a VIP coming and would like to see the Prime Minister. And I said, well, who's the VIP? And she said, well, it's the Vice President. And at the time, the U.S. had the steel and aluminum tariffs on it, and they were using that Section 232, which is the steel and aluminum imports from Canada are a national security threat. Right. And I said, well, Kelly, tell Mike Pence that if the steel and aluminum tariffs are still on at the end of the month, he'll be more welcome in Havana than he will be in Ottawa. And she said, David, I can't tell him that. And I said, well, you don't have to tell him that. Just tell him I said it. And so she said, oh, well, okay. And then, the steel and aluminum tariffs came off 2 weeks later. And the Vice President arrived at the Ottawa airport, and he got off the plane, and he came over to me, and he said, so, am I more welcome in Ottawa now than I would be in Havana? And I said, yes, Mr. Vice President, absolutely. But,
he did get the message.
Every once in a while, you have to kind of, do something to get their attention, because we're out of sight, out of mind, and they're focused on other things.
Yes, and a dose of Canadian humor can go a long way. We have a fair amount of that. So who are our strongest trading partners now? Where can we turn to diversify some of these relationships? You're in Europe right now. Just take us through sort of what we need to bolster.
Well, we've got free trade agreements with Europe. We have, we're part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so we have access to more free trade agreements than any other G7 country. And yet still 75% or 78% of our exports go to the United States. And so, yes, we have to diversify. And obviously our natural resources are, one of the most important ones, in the sense that we can help lower greenhouse gas emissions and get rid of pollutants by replacing coal with natural gas in Asia and perhaps even in Europe. But there are also there are areas. I mean, obviously we've had a great history in nuclear energy, and we should be looking at that. The agricultural field has lots of possibilities for diversification.
Right.
But I think, we are still going to be highly dependent on the United States for our prosperity. And so we need to find a way to do the best we can. And that's going to take some patience and some toughness.
Right. Okay. Really interesting. It sounds, yes. I mean, it's not like we're not going to be trading long term. We're just renegotiating things, it sounds like. Here's another question. Who do you think that we should respond with tariffs on exports to oil, to electricity? These are two premiers that are talking about just this in different ways. And if you don't think we should respond with tariffs on oil and electricity, why not?
Well, I think, one of the things that, is important in all of this is to keep Canada united.
Canada united.
And I think if, for instance, we were to restrict oil exports from Alberta, that would cause a lot of problems. There may be other ways to do it in the sense of, building up our own strategic oil reserve, holding back oil from the United States, but creating our own reserve. The other way is actually to do something about building another pipeline, and getting more of our resources to market and diversifying our supply. I think it's I know Premier Ford's been talking about cutting off electricity, and that's if that's an initiative that comes from him, then that's great. I just don't want to see the federal government decide that they're going to, pick a particular industry without collaboration with the province.
Right. Really interesting. Are we in the midst of renegotiating CUSMA or the old NAFTA again? Is that what this is? Because the tariffs obviously don't fit with the free trade agreement. It's anathema to that. But are we trying to figure out what the building blocks will be for a new trading partnership, or actually we trying to get out of something that is pinning us as the 51st state? Is this trade or is this annexation? Both are getting talked about.
I mean, I've had, people say, well, why don't we try to open the review of the CUSMA agreement that's scheduled for 2026? Let's do it now. And my answer to that is, why would we bother? Then you've got a framework for negotiation. Well, you don't have a framework for negotiation with Donald Trump.
Right.
If you did, he'd be sticking to the agreement that he said was the best ever. So we've got to hang tough for a while, inflict some pain on them, and when they are ready to have a rational, serious discussion about defense, security, and prosperity, then we can sit down. And I think that maybe 6 months from now, 8 months from now, I don't know, but we shouldn't sit down and start putting things on the table that we think might get his attention, because all he'll do at the present moment is just to take it and ask for more. And we should be ready to get our act together on things that we should have been doing anyway, but we shouldn't be showing any weakness. Not because all he'll want is he'll want more.
Okay.
I understand that for businesses, for investors, that this means we're going to have a period of uncertainty. And you know what? That's right. We are. I think, though, the benefit of all of this is that perhaps it will force us to get our act together on a whole series of things that we have just let fall by the wayside for too long. And that includes our productivity. It includes getting projects built. It includes, over regulation, too much bureaucracy. I mean, all of these things, and the interprovincial trade. So maybe the wake-up call will be good for us, but we shouldn't be too anxious to think that just going into some kind of a renegotiated CUSMA with a guy who just forgot about that deal and has done something different.
Yeah.
That's not the right answer.
I want you to take us into, if you're all right with this, and just, be honest if your throat's bothering you too much, but if we could just go another 5-10 minutes to dig into a couple of industries themselves. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
Okay.
And I apologize. Sorry for the cold.
Oh, listen, you can't, we get colds. It's part of it. Is the discussion of, for instance, can we move on from the fentanyl discussion? I mean, that to an extent is being dragged out, which is, I'm just sort of curious if it comes up over the next little while. Do you feel that that is at least ring fenced?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they used that because it gave them a pretext for doing the tariffs. They could use a sort of an obscure law in the United States to do it. I've heard nobody seriously, thinks that we are the problem. So I think we can move on from that. I mean, I think we need to be diligent about making sure that our border is secure and that we are doing everything we can to crack down on drug smuggling.
Mm-hmm. But it's not going to be the sort of center of the discussions going forward. One of the things that is getting already discussed is if we're putting retaliatory the money made essentially from retaliatory tariffs and putting them on U.S. goods coming in here, there's already a discussion about where that bucket of money goes. Does it go to, for instance, tax cuts? Does it go to, to sort of nation building discussions, it seems, on some level? What do you think about this? Is this sort of jumping the gun, getting back into sort of politics at the top in this country? Or is there, is there a serious question about how we can use new money ultimately to build something?
Well, yeah, I mean, what we shouldn't do is just to sort of dole it out helter-skelter to individuals who may or may not be hurt by this. We need to find a way to have a long-term solution rather than a quick fix. And whether that's tax cuts or whether that's investing in or building up, the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program to allow more Indigenous communities to participate in natural resource projects. I mean, we should be focused on, building the country as opposed to buying off, individual groups. And I don't want to sound insensitive to the pain that people are going to be suffering, but if you really want to fix the problem long term, you don't just do short term spending.
Coming back to the discussion of potash, also to nuclear and capabilities therein to generate better things for agriculture and also for new sources of energy ultimately going forward. Again, where do they fit into the trade picture, do you think? I mean, potash is, again, a global commodity. It gets sold on the global markets for global rates, and there are lots of different things that come into how those prices are set, Russia and Ukraine being part of it, but and Belarus. These are industries that we have here. There's been even discussion about, company heads moving across the border to cheaper tax structures and so on. I'm kind of curious what you think about Canadian companies producing something that we need, but also need to sell. What sort of incremental change could there be to diverting our natural resources back to us?
Well, I think we have a robust agricultural sector, and we should be thinking about how can we make it even more productive, and that, again, some of the regulations that have been put in place that restrict fertilizer use and the like, I don't think are particularly helpful. And in terms of the energy industry, the reality is that we had an export industry in nuclear where the supply chain was largely Canadian. We got lots of uranium. It doesn't rely on enriched uranium. And, we've now got a situation where, small modular nuclear reactors may be part of the answer. So we've got to invest in those things and make sure that we've got an opportunity to the energy sources of the future, as well as natural gas in the short term.
Right. Okay.
So I'm quite optimistic about it if we can just kind of get as I say, get our act together. I mean, one of the things that you look at is years ago, a couple of decades ago, the Toronto Stock Exchange was the center of global capital raising for the mining industry, and we had a number of very, very strong industries in this country, very strong companies, and now that's largely not the case. And we've hurt ourselves by again, over regulation and not being as productive as we could be, and we can't afford to miss those kinds of opportunities in industries where we have a leadership, and yet we find a way to either raise taxes too much or to over-regulate. So hopefully this is a shock treatment that will make Canada much more competitive and ensure our prosperity in the long run. Even if we have to rely on the U.S. market, for a lot of the things that into the future, and we can't diversify a huge amount, we got to make sure that we are extraordinarily productive in that, and that we they know that they need to rely on us to for some of the important things like they used to with aluminum and others.
And steel. So as a final question, Ambassador David MacNaughton, I wonder if you can tell us what you think might be, for sure, regardless of which party is running the country, what do you think for sure will be in a federal budget as maybe a new item or a massively bolstered item? I don't know, but what will for sure be there no matter who is running the joint?
Well, I think they'll get rid of the silly increase in the capital gains tax that happened regardless of who wins, and hopefully also think about the contribution we can make to global greenhouse gas emissions, rather than having the focus on our country's emissions, because our country's emissions are 1.5% of the global emissions, and by getting Southeast Asia off of coal, we could do more to reduce global emissions than anything we did in Canada. So hopefully that happens, and I think that the whole breakdown of interprovincial trade barriers is worthwhile. Just a last little story. I was at a business session the other day and was talking about how I like to see these kinds of crises as an opportunity rather than just a problem, and that I sort of half jokingly said that if Donald Trump manages to shake us out of our complacency, we should think about giving him the Order of Canada, because of the contribution he will have made to make us awake. we might not be able to let him into the country because he's a convicted felon, but it's I hope all of this gets us to a position where we are much smarter and think about where this country came from, not just in terms of relying on our history, but using that as a guide to where we could go in the future. And I think that's pretty exciting for this country.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for joining us. That was an absolute delight. We really appreciate you sharing your time with us, Ambassador, and good luck on your travels. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Fidelity Connects podcast. Now, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Fidelity Connects on your podcast platform of choice. And if you like what you're hearing, leave a review or a 5-star rating. Fidelity mutual funds and ETFs are available by working with a financial advisor or through an online brokerage account. Visit fidelity.ca/howtobuy for more information. On fidelity.ca, you can also find more information on future live webcasts. And don't forget to follow Fidelity Canada on X. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Fidelity Investments Canada ULC or its affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment, tax, or legal advice. It is not an offer to sell or buy, or an endorsement, recommendation, or sponsorship of any entity or security cited. Read a fund's prospectus before investing. Funds are not guaranteed. Their values change frequently, and past performance may not be repeated. Fees, expenses, and commissions are all associated with fund investments. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.